here, and hopefully you'll be able to see my screen. I'll ask Mandy to confirm. Can you see it okay?
I cannot actually.
Really?
I can still see you though, and your beautiful face.
Wow, that is, well, thank you for that. That was, let's see, now maybe. It's always kind of iffy.
Yep,
Hopefully.
it's starting. There you go.
All right. So here we go. Welcome to Learning Revolution. This is the Thrive at EDU show every Wednesday at 4 p.m. And I will have a different guest every single week talking about things related to education, different topics. If you have not joined in the prior shows, I've had guests who we've talked about social emotional learning. We've also talked about artificial intelligence. Preparing for the future of work. Last week, I had my friend Jennifer Casa-Todd, and we talked about digital citizenship, digital leadership, social media. We talked about a lot of different things. And so those recordings are available, and they're also available on YouTube. So you can always go back. And again, this session is being recorded. And I'm very excited today to have another one of my good friends as my guest, and that's my friend Mandy Froehlich, and I'll let her introduce herself in a little bit. But we're going to be talking about a lot of things, mostly focused on mentally preparing for the return to school. And just to give you a little background, my name is Rachelle Dene Poth. I would love for you to connect with me on Twitter or Instagram, wherever you are located. It's rdene915. I am a Spanish and STEAM teacher, also a consultant and an attorney. I love learning. I am currently now the past president of the ISTE Teacher Education Network. Just finished my 2-year term of being president a couple of weeks ago, so I'm still getting used to saying that. I stay connected in some different communities just to keep learning and bring opportunities for my students. I'm an author and a blogger, and I've written a couple of books in the past year, sharing stories, not just of myself, but of my students and of other educators, because that's really how I learn, is from my students and from those stories from other educators. So that's a little bit about me, but I'm going to introduce you now to my guest today, Mandy Froehlich, and let her tell you a little bit about herself and the work that she does.
Muted. Hey, everybody. My name's Mandy Froehlich, and Kathy Sue's going to be so sick of hearing this stuff because she's heard it all before. But just to kind of introduce myself a little bit, I'm Froehlich. I'm on Twitter or www.divergentedu.com. I used to be an elementary teacher and a tech integrator, and then I was a director of innovation and technology and recently retired from that position. And now I speak and consult full time. I have a couple books, and you can see them up there. So The Fire Within and Reignite the Flames are both about teacher mental health and engagement. Divergent EDU is based on kind of best practices for supporting teachers and being innovative thinkers. And then I also co-host Teacher's Aid for the BAM Radio Network. And Teacher's Aid is a podcast on social emotional support for teachers. And then finally, I am an adjunct instructor for the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where I teach grad courses on becoming an administrator. And I think that's just about it. Rachelle's one of my bestest friends in the whole world. So
yeah, and I love that we got connected a couple of years ago, and I love that we've had so many great experiences together and traveling and writing or trying to write together. But I do admire all of the work that you do, especially in this area. And so I'm very thankful, because I know, and it's funny that you say, and that's about it. That is not about it. You do so much and you share so much. And so I'm really thankful that you're here today with us to talk about what is a hugely important topic. And I'm sure and hopeful that people that are joining us will have some questions. And so today we're going to discuss mental preparation. And that is looking to the upcoming school year. What are some concerns that you have? I mean, looking at teacher disengagement possibly, or teacher burnout, the stress, anything that we're feeling. Also looking at mental health and wellness. And again, if you have questions, make sure that you drop them into the chat. It's meant to be really interactive, and this opportunity to ask questions from our guests and to engage in conversations. And feel free to use the hashtag for Learning Revolution and tweet something out, tag Mandy and myself in those tweets, and we will get started. I'm actually going to stop sharing so we can have more of a conversation, also check the chat. So welcome from Egypt. That is fantastic. I love seeing where everybody's joining us from. So I guess the first question that I would ask to Mandy, I mean, right now, what are some of the things that you hear that educators are talking about, or the concerns that people have about, I mean, anything in general, but maybe specifically thinking about the return to school?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of, I think, a lot of interesting information that's been shared lately in the way that schools are starting to kind of finalize what they're doing when they come back. I still actually think there's still room for change, with California all of a sudden kind of deciding to change the route that they were going of going back or in a blended format, and instead declaring that they were going all online. And so I do think that there's still room for change. However, there have been a lot of districts that have said, no, we're going to start sending kids back, whether they, I've heard of districts saying that, well, we're going to kind of roll them into it and they'll go half time for the first 2 weeks and then they'll 3/4 time. Like, I don't really understand what the purpose of that is, but there are a lot of different plans out there. And so I think the reactions from those plans are starting to come through. And the issue with what's going on really is that there are no good answers. There's not a great solution to this. I think probably one of the best things that we could do for the safety of our kids and for the safety of our families and parents is probably to do online learning. But there's a very legitimate concern from parents that they do have to work and pay their bills. And some people would say, well, that is secondary to safety. If you only have $17 for food for the week and you haven't paid your mortgage yet, that's also a safety concern. And so there's a lot of just different issues that are going on, and I think that it's starting to ramp back up the struggles and the mental health that that people have been feeling anyway because of pandemic learning. And so typically I would say that, summer is a time for teachers to maybe focus on special projects or do things that they love to do and kind of rejuvenate. And I don't think that they have gotten that this summer. And so it's going into the new year, that's going to be a challenge. David said, any tips on how parents can help their children navigate their feelings during school reopenings? Yeah, and I mean, some of, going into these conversations, like there's so many, we could have an all-day webinar just on mental health and reopening. So yes, I do have some tips. I think that anything that parents or teachers can do to help kids express their emotions is always a good thing. And so helping them understand, one of the things that I remember when I was a kid is that having a journal was cool, right? But nobody ever really told me how to use it. And some people journal naturally and some people don't. And I'm not a writer, and so I don't. And but as I got older and I learned how to journal in the form of blog posts, that became really helpful to me to be able to name my my emotions that I was having and things like that. And I think that's one thing we could actually do for kids too, is help them find an outlet to reflect. Whether that maybe they're not big writers or maybe they're too young to write, have them do it in a sort of video blog format. If they are old enough to write, help them understand what a journal is. And even if you don't like to write sentences, you can definitely draw. You can try drawing your feelings and see if you can come up with a word, just one word to explain how you're feeling. And that's actually a kind of strategy for helping to identify emotions too, is to, talk about or draw that emotion, put a word to that emotion, and then actually sitting in that emotion so you can feel what that feels like, and you can name it easier again. And so helping kids kind of work through those things, finding a ways to draw things out or something like that. And then helping them name the emotion, and then helping them feel the emotion so that they can work through that and be able to name it in the future. Something else I would recommend as for kids in particular, although it works for adults as well, is something called mindful coloring. Mindful coloring is it's a mindfulness technique. It's sort of specific to, you pick a pattern that's a little bit more complicated. Some people like to say choosing something like a mandala, where it's got little intricate pieces to it, and then focusing only on the coloring for as long as you can. So like 15 or so minutes for an adult. Obviously little kids it's going to be less. But even when I've used that in classrooms, when I've worked with students and they've had meltdowns or something, the mindful coloring has really helped as well. So hopefully those are two kind of small tips to help out.
Yeah, those are, I like the mindfulness one, because that is another topic that has been I've seen a lot, especially in the last couple of days with so many different learning events going on. A lot of people, big focus areas have been social emotional learning, forming connections with students, also trying to get away from screen time and practice more mindfulness. And so very important for that. And so thanks, David, for asking that question. And anybody who has just joined in, please drop the questions in. I'll keep monitoring that, and we'll share some resources. Mandy has a great blog on it's her site, mandyfroehlich.com. But I did want to ask her, she had a blog that she had written recently, and it was talking about the return to school and asking the great questions. And she had some different things to focus on. And I know I was in a school meeting, I can't even keep track of the days anymore, but I think it was yesterday morning. We're looking at going back to school, coming up with different questions. And there was a school district in New Jersey that had shared where each month when they met, they just kept adding the questions to this document. And what started, it was like 70 some questions. And I think it's almost at 500 different questions now that teachers have surrounding school. And so, Mandy, are there some that you notice that are very consistent with what districts are asking, whether it's related to students or teachers or both?
Yeah, so a lot of the focus that I see is generally on, and there's still good questions. I don't want to say anything that anyone throws out there are bad questions, because frankly, everybody is just doing whatever they can at a time where nobody really knows the right thing to do. And anybody who claims to know the right thing to do don't believe them, because there's nobody that knows the exact right thing to do. So everybody is just doing their absolute best. So I don't want to say there are bad questions, but there are some questions that I felt are a little bit more district and logistical focused that potentially could detract from some of the other questions that really need to be at the forefront of what's going on. And to kind of, the questions, those types of questions I would be talking about are things like, how can we get more devices to our students and more Wi-Fi? Are we going to fill the learning gaps for students who struggled, never attended pandemic learning? What online platform tools should we be purchasing in case we need to continue online? How can we create buy-in for teachers, or how can we make teachers get Google EDU certified? So again, not bad questions, just questions that are more technology focused and logistical focused, district focused, things like that. The questions that I think are better ones to ask are, things like, that are more human-centered questions. So, for example, how is your staff holding up? And I've been talking about this a lot, and really, I've been talking about it because I realized it as one of my benefits of the pandemic time, was that I got the chance to really sit down and look at my kids and see how they are and check out their faces and go, oh my gosh, I can't remember the last time I took a moment just to look at you. And because everybody's always so busy. And it kind of came from that. So the idea is, when's the last time you did that with your staff? When's the last time that, whether you're an administrator or a teacher, it doesn't matter, when's the last time you looked at the staff that you work with and looked at their faces where you can see how people feel, especially the people that tend to wear their emotions on their sleeve, which is common for a teacher. And, are their shoulders slumped? Do they look defeated? Do they look re-energized? Do they look like they loved pandemic learning and they just want to share everything that they did? Because that's going to give us a lot of really good information about how quickly we move forward. And because we're going to have to recognize at some point that the mental health aspect of this is significant. We had a pandemic. People were lonely. I have joked around multiple times about even now saying that every time a gathering gets canceled for me, I want to play the little song from The Little Mermaid, like I want to be where the people are, that's where I want to be. And I've joked about that several times because I am home with 4 of my favorite people, and I'm still sometimes as lonely like crazy. And so we've gone through this period of loneliness. We've gone through this period where some people are suffering financially. Some people who may have been in not awesome relationships before. They certainly didn't get any better being home 24 hours a day over an extended period of time. We have a lot of these different things. We could have different struggles with like depression, anxiety, and alcoholism and stuff like that, all during a pandemic. Then we move into the murder of George Floyd and everything that's happening in the area of social justice, as well as the violent murder being played over and over and over again on the news. And so we've seen that, multiple times over the course of the summer when we were already dealing with mental health issues from the pandemic. We're now going into a time where nobody knows what's going on. Like if there's one thing that teachers love, it's routine. Like we set them up all the time. We go in and we're like, oh, first hour, second hour, third hour, or first we're going to do our community group. Then we're going to move on to math. Like we love routine. And we have no routine right now. And we don't even know what's coming because we don't know if we're going back. We don't know. So we basically are walking into this knowing nothing, which means that our focus needs to be human focused. The idea that we need to get tech out to people is important. It is not as important as the well-being of the teacher and students that are going to be using it. And so when I say that I've seen good questions and better questions, the better questions say, how can we support our people? The good questions say, how can we get devices in the hands of everybody? Some more questions like, how do we make people feel safe going forward? And this question is actually interesting to me from the standpoint of safe for us used to be the active shooter drills. And how can we feel safe with active shooter drills? We're now going to be moving into a time that if you are going back to school, if you're going back to a brick and mortar setting, safe could mean active shooter drills and dealing with the pandemic. And so, how do we create an environment where people feel safe when their first inclination is going to be to not feel safe? Let's see, I had, how are you going to increase staff's baseline knowledge of trauma and incorporate embedded SEL competencies into online learning? So if you are staying online, how can you embed SEL competencies into that while still focusing on content, but understanding that if we're dealing with trauma and you're focusing on content, the kids aren't learning content anyway if you're not addressing the trauma. And then I think it was just, I think one of the last ones was how can we provide professional learning opportunities, not as a way of getting teachers to be better, but instead reframing that as how can we get teachers the learning opportunities they need so that they feel supported, comfortable, and safe going back into online learning or back into the brick and mortar setting. And so again, instead of saying, we want to make you better, which is always the part that I cringe at, how can we actually say, we want to support you in getting what you need to feel less anxiety and to feel safe. So those are kind of the two different questions that I had addressed in that blog post. That was a really long explanation.
No, but it's good. But I'm thinking too, like with social emotional learning, for example, talking about it. I mean, the last couple of years, the more that I've learned about it, I didn't realize that some of the things I was doing in my classroom were helping students to build those skills. I didn't know the name for it. I was just trying to get them to work together and build relationships and all of that. And so learning more about it, definitely have learned more about it from you. And looking at it as teachers, as we go back to this year with so many unknowns. And I know with my school, we had a meeting yesterday, like I said, and we're going to try to go back hybrid part days. So there is so much stress and anxiety in that and worry, just making those transitions and taking all of that on. And I'm thinking now, listening to you talk and also having read some things since yesterday about it, it is so important for us to understand how to address social emotional learning needs, because we have to do that with our students. And I'm thinking about, okay, my self-awareness and my self-management. Okay, I'm stressed and my emotions and all of these feelings. I need to know how to kind of get a handle on that. And what am I doing for myself, for self-care and for mindfulness? And I'm not all that great at some of those things, because I just feel like I need somewhat of a routine, and I feel like I need to keep going and moving, even though it's the summer and we have the summers off. This is not the normal summer because we've never had this experience. And trying to figure out, like, where do you start and how do you slow down and how do you find some balance and how do you put on that brave front for students when you don't feel like being brave yourself? That's the part that's kind of, you know, I am afraid. I mean, definitely I'm not going to throw that out there. Like, I am afraid because there are so many unknowns with this. And I mean, where does somebody begin? How does somebody get started to kind of like find an area to focus on if you start to feel overwhelmed with so many emotions and frustrations and all of this back and forth? I mean, like, what do you recommend that somebody does first, or where should they, I mean, what should they do?
Yeah, so overwhelm is interesting. And if you ever want to look up anything, if once you say to yourself, I am so overwhelmed, I'm losing my mind, you've gone past the like initial pieces of overwhelm and you're starting to go like quickly down the hill. So you need to catch yourself fast. The actual first kind of steps of overwhelm is to start, you slowly, even if you don't intentionally do it, you slowly start to pull back. And this may mean kind of silly things like going to the bathroom more often, or taking snack breaks more often, or finding a reason that you have to run to the grocery store, or picking up your phone and spending more time on social media than you would typically do. That's actually how the overwhelm begins. Your body and your brain start to go, okay, look, I've had enough, and I have to pull you back from this because I'm starting to lose it a little bit. And so I would say that one of the things that you can do, and I recommend this all the time, and I'm not awesome at it either, but is to figure out your areas of self-care and what you like to do prior to the point where you get to that feeling of overwhelm. And to really just make at least your top 2 ways of practicing self-care as just an absolute priority. And again, I'm not awesome at this either, but I have realized like my top 2 priorities are like a walk or walking on the treadmill and meditating. Those are my 2 top priorities. And I've missed them the last 2 days and I can feel it. I can feel like my overwhelm is starting to get to that space where I'm like, ooh, this isn't good. And honestly, it would be a lot better for me to do a half an hour on the treadmill and to do 15 minutes of meditation than it would be for me to start deciding to play on social media a little bit more, or to, take the extra trips to the bathroom, or to have to go grocery shopping. Like, I'm saving myself time in the long run. And so I think really heading off overwhelm at the pass is really the way you want to go.
Yeah, and I had to laugh whenever you talked about the snacks, and I'm thinking, okay, and going to the store, and I think, okay, as of today, it's been 4 months since I've actually set foot into a store, and so that option is out for me. And the snacks, that has definitely not been a problem, because I've visited the fridge and the pantry more often in the past like 4 months than I have in probably the past year at this point. But I have been better with, I get up early, which is not always that easy because I tend to stay up really late and work and do things. But I find that when I get up early and the first thing I do is I come downstairs and I go right outside and I go for a walk. Now, mind you, while I'm walking, sometimes I'm not listening to anything. Sometimes it might be, surprisingly, country music. Imagine that, right, for me. Or I'm reading emails, but that has really helped me to at least have a little bit of a routine. Now, when we were at the end of the school year, I struggled with trying to figure out, okay, what do I do with my day? Because I was having meetings with my students, but I felt so kind of, I mean, we're in our space the whole time. We're not able to connect with other people so much. Thankfully, we have the technology where we can have coffee meetings with Zoom or conferences or whatever it is. But it is hard to really decide to take a break from some things or to focus on self-care, even when we know we need to do that, or even when people say, well, you need to take a break or go take a nap. Like, it is really difficult, because for me, I always feel like I'm going to miss an opportunity that might help somebody else, or I don't want to take a day off of email, because that just means they're not going to go away. They're still going to be there. But
Right.
If I'm not taking care of myself, then I'm not going to be able to bring my best self to my students in my classroom, let alone my family and friends. And so it is very important to do. And listening to your ideas and tips, I mean, it's good. And I hope people will ask some questions in here or share your experiences too, the things that you're struggling with. And I love also, Melody dropped this in here, and you talked about like looking at your kids and having that time to just take a break and be a mom and engage in activities with them while you're in the house. And I did see a lot of that. Families just getting back to the basic things. It's interesting how, I mean, we're moving forward, but we also, the ways we were interacting and the activities that we were doing, we were going back and just playing board games or just getting outside and taking walks. I mean, I saw so many people posting about doing that. And Kristen was in here and she had a blog about just taking in the air. Kristen's still in here, taking in the air and just breathing and having that time away. So very important for those. But again, being a summer unlike anything else, it's hard to take a break right now. And
right. And I think it's so important too, to start to understand the little things that are about to start happening. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm a relatively reflective person. And so there are very few times that I don't feel an emotion that I say, oh, that's because of, and I can name the root cause of what the emotion is. But just because I can name it doesn't necessarily mean I have like the tools to deal with it at the moment. But things that to me have been kind of strange realizations. So I'll give you an example. I was right after, so I'm in Wisconsin. Wisconsin Supreme Court declared the stay-at-home order unconstitutional, lifted everything opened back up. And so one of the things that I did first is two of my kids had a doctor's appointment. And so I took, they had to get in, and so I brought them in. And I walked into the medical place or the pediatrician's office, and I'm filling out stuff for them. And next to me, there's a mom, and she has 3 triplet boys who are adorable. but very, very loud. Okay. And I'm not typically sensitive to sound and things like that, but the kids were very loud. Normally I would have been like, oh, triplet boys, that's adorable. Like I would expect them to be loud. And I started to feel like I was going to have an anxiety attack because for months I have sat inside with my teenage kids who are relatively quiet, who, I haven't been around the hustle and bustle and noise of normal community stuff or a school or anything like that. And by the time I left, I felt like I was actually going to have an anxiety attack. And when I started to think about it, I was like, what was that all about? That was ridiculous. And then I realized I'm just not accustomed to that anymore. Like it takes 20 days to build a habit? We've built habits of sitting in our house. Like anything else that we do that's different is going to feel weird now. And another thing that had caught me off guard was my work picking up. My work isn't even near what my work was prior to the pandemic. And yet I feel like I'm drowning because I'm not accustomed to hard deadlines anymore. I'm not like, I've had to get on Zoom calls, but I was traveling all the time. I wasn't on Zoom calls as much. It's just, everything feels like a lot. And yet it's nowhere near what it was before. And so I think understanding that we're going to go through a period of trying to figure out what it is that we wanted to, what it is that we want to take out of the pandemic with us. That was a good thing, like the looking at our kids, type stuff again, doing stuff with them, taking time for ourselves, whatever that was. We have to figure out what we want to take out of that. And then we have to try to kind of morph it into this new life where we're trying to get back to normal. That's never going to be normal. And it's hard to even mentally wrap your mind around what that even means.
I love hearing your stories just because like the process, I mean, it's real, our experiences and just laughing and talking about your family and your kids and everything. But thinking about my own experience, like routine has become being in this space. And Melody even said, am I ever out of this chair? And not that much, honestly, because this is how we've been connecting and doing everything, right? Just shopping or interacting, and we have our coffee meetings and do all kinds of learning things. And it's so important. I've seen just so many teachers right now just taking in all of these different learning opportunities. There are so many spread out this week, this month, and even through August. And so it's great to see so much out there, especially focused on a lot of the issues that have been coming up, dealing with COVID and teaching during a pandemic, and how to plan remote instruction and how to do social distancing if you're doing things like, learning stations in class, for example. But then also people are looking to find resources for culturally responsive teaching and addressing equity in the classroom. And when everything was happening with George Floyd, like you mentioned, I was just trying to process my own thoughts. And I really didn't know if I should write something, if I should do a podcast, if I should say anything. And I was just kind of taking all of it in, doing an internal audit, processing as best as I can, looking at all the resources that were being shared, the different books, the different blogs, the different websites that were out there, just so I could learn, because I didn't feel, obviously I didn't know enough, and I wanted to be really informed and prepared. And one of your blogs, you had written actually two of them. One was you were just kind of processing your own thoughts about it and trying to figure out how to talk about racism and your own role in it. But then more recently, you had a blog post that you wrote with Desmond, right? And it was talking about asking questions that could lead to better mental health support for Black students and students of color. And I wondered if there were some things that you could share with us here about that experience, or ideas that you and Desmond shared in that blog to help us as we're planning and considering that as well and heading back to our classrooms and to our schools.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've known for a long time, when I talk about trauma and things, I really do focus a lot on adults. But I have seen the research on racial trauma and what race does. I don't I don't think a lot of people know this, but I've got 2 master's degrees. One of my master's theses was actually on taking a look at the percentage of our students of color who were sent to the office and had serious consequences versus our white students, and it was incredibly eye-opening even back then, and that was years ago. And so it is something that's always really interested me. My mistake that I made is in talking about race is that I mistakenly thought that loving my fellow people, my Black people, people of color, was enough, and it wasn't. And so when I talk about my role in racism, that's where it comes from, is that I really thought, you know, I several friends I'm very close to, like, I thought loving them was enough. And what I figured out through the process of the murder of George Floyd is that I have never done enough to help. I would say that I don't even know if I would actually have categorized myself previous to this as an anti-racist, not because I was racist, but because I wasn't actively anti-racist. And so that's kind of the difference. And so that's kind of one of the areas that I have grown, I feel like, in the last few months, is being able to actually take those terms and use them correctly. And it is, some of it for me is almost like learning a foreign language. When I talk about it, I have to be very careful what I say, because I need to put it through a filter to make sure I'm using the right terms, and I'm being as careful and you know, as supportive as I possibly can, because I certainly don't want to hurt the very people I'm trying to support. So in this blog post, what I did is I went through, I was thinking the one day about a situation that we had where we had some students who were either directly from Mexico or whose parents had been. And whether they were, the interesting thing is whether they were documented or not didn't seem to make a difference. But when they were talking about the poor treatment of the students and parents who were being deported near the, my gosh, border. I could come up with that. When they were talking about that, we watched our students go through this, I don't know what else to explain it as, a traumatic experience where you could see that they felt that they weren't sure if they were going to be sent back, or their parents were going to be, or what was going to happen. Was somebody going to come in the middle of the night? Was, you know, were they going to have to leave in the middle of the night? Were they even going to be at school the next day? Should they do their homework if they're not? Like, there's all of these, and then to think that they're even thinking about homework half the time wasn't actually happening. And so, you know, that when I was thinking about our Black students coming back to school after the murder of George Floyd, I thought back to that time where there was a you know, targeted sort of situation that was happening just on those students, and started to kind of think of questions that would relate back to the racial trauma that I had known about already. That you know, racism in itself causes a certain you know, a certain special kind of trauma. And so I talked to a friend of mine, and we started kind of brainstorming questions that we would have when it comes to talking about our you know, our Black students returning to school. And you know, some of them were like, how do we support Black students or students of color who don't feel like their schools are safe places, due to teachers being seen as authorities, as our police officers, and not knowing if they can feel safe or protected by white teachers. And of course, that would be their perception of not being protected or feeling safe. And I think that there might be, I felt like when I wrote it, there might be some people who think that's a stretch, and yet I don't think it is at all. And there might be some people who would say, well, that's not our fault. It may not be your fault, but it doesn't mean it's not your problem. Like, we still have to work towards fixing it. things like, how do we emotionally support students when they find their white friends may not be the anti-racist that they thought they were? How do we support and understand their grief and also address the issue of racism? I've had to go through this where I have started to, to speak about this openly, and people have said things that I'm like, whoa, hang on now. We've been friends for years. I can't believe you just said that. And we're so far off the, so far off the same kind of line of thinking that it's made me question friendships. And that can be really difficult when you've been friends with people for so long. And I'm an adult. So hypothetically, I should be able to deal with it. But how do we help students go through that if those types of things are happening? So just kind of, what do we, whether school continues online or not, will we see an uptick in student truancy that is rooted in fear of systemic racism? Even things like having guards and school liaison officers, particularly if they're in uniforms and guns, like what's that going to do? And some people have said, well, they need to be removed. But the fact of the matter is that we still need to have the safety with school shootings. And so how do we balance so it just even sounds ridiculous. Like, how do we balance the trauma of school shootings with the trauma that might be present with watching, being in the presence of a police officer? Because there are going to be some cases where students have questions and they may not know how to answer or how to ask them. They may not know the correct, maybe even terminology to use. They may not know the right way to voice what they actually want to say, because the emotions are so huge. And so, how are we going to support students in some of those areas? So Melody said, is it hard for you to write about? I'm guessing you mean the racism stuff. I'm still learning. I think that my biggest fear, and Melody and I were doing a show one time, and a lady who was watching asked a really interesting question, and I loved her for asking it. She said, "Are you afraid?" And Melody, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something like, "Are you afraid you're going to lose fans because of some of the anti-racist things that you say," or something to that effect, or live by living an anti-racist life, or something like that. And I said, I first of all, I don't feel like I have fans. What I've always looked for on social media are people who support me so I can support them, and who are willing to collaborate and all of those kinds of things. And if they're not going to support me and they can't, even if it's, agree to disagree, whatever it is, I don't really, honestly, it's okay if we're not connected. And so I'm not worried about that. My concern all the time is just because I'm still learning, that I may say something that may actually damage or hurt some of the people that I'm trying to support. And so that really is where some of my anxiety comes in. So yeah, that's kind of about that post.
Yeah, that is a good question too, because I know, like I said, it's hard. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And for me, a large part of it was just, like I said, reading. And then I was asked to be on a panel with Nicole Howard and Valerie Lewis and some others. And we were talking about equity and racism. And I even said, I admitted to them, I said, it was a difficult conversation for me to have, because for so many years I was afraid to say the wrong thing. And what I value the most is having a group of friends that I know that I can ask those questions to, that will tell me, like, no, this is the way that you should refer to something, or that will correct me, but not stop being my friend because maybe I asked the wrong question, or because I made a mistake. It's, having those comfortable spaces where we can connect and ask those questions, because we need to keep learning. I mean, I don't know all there is to know. There is so much to learn. And just finding the right words. And so whenever you read that, I remember I was walking that morning and I read your blog, and I both of them actually, that the first one that you wrote about your thoughts, and then the one that you shared, and I should drop that link here in the chat too before I forget. But I just appreciated that. And then the more that I saw people doing that, it made it easier for me to kind of feel some comfort talking about that, because initially I was kind of holding back a little bit, and having some ideas, at least for my own classroom, my students too, to help them to be able to have those conversations as well. And Mandy, Melody asked the question, I think, can you accept that we will say the wrong thing and be okay if someone calls us out?
Well, so yes, I can be okay if somebody calls us out. My issue is sometimes how people get called out. I do think that there is a respectful way for everybody to have a conversation, and I think that doesn't always happen, particularly on social media. So I'll try to give an example. I'm going to use the example of the book. Oh my gosh. What book are we reading? You read it too, Rachelle. The
White Fragility.
White Fragility. Yeah, White Fragility. Thanks. And so, yeah, Melody, so White Fragility. I'll use the book White Fragility. So White Fragility came out very originally as one of the books, read these books. And then it was, had kind of gone around on social media, well, you shouldn't read that book because it's written by a white person, and purchase books by people that are Black. And there were some people who said, why are you reading that book? Are you, is the information more consumable because the author is white? And I'm gonna be honest, it was the first one on a list that somebody tweeted out, and I bought it right away. And I didn't actually know the author was white until I started reading it. And I was like, really? The author's white? And so I think in some ways, you're not going to make everybody happy all the time. I think the goal should always be that we're continuously trying to learn. I think that if White Fragility is the only book you read, then I think you should branch out and purchase another one and buy a Black author and read it. White Fragility for me was never going to be the only book I was going to read. And so that wasn't an issue for me. But I think that there needs to be a little bit of an element of, assuming positive intent in some cases. And in some cases, I feel like that's missing. And so I don't mind getting called out on things. I do mind when I'm trying really hard and I may say something that's not right. And, if it would be kind of put out on social media as something, really, really negative. So.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing about the books. I know that Allison Apsey had put a list of books for like a book study for a year, and there were a bunch of them on there. And I had never read any of those books. And I thought, well, this is a way that I can learn. And I was looking at blogs and resources and like teaching tolerance. And I did read White Fragility, and I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, or How Not to Be an Anti-Racist. I messed that up. What else did I read? I'm Still Here, by Austin Channing, and I have a couple other ones that I'm reading. And I do recall seeing people put on there, well, you shouldn't read this. And for me, I just want to be informed. And so I would like to, and I don't know if that's part of the attorney part of me, where I like to know all of the different angles and sides and perspectives and then kind of process it. But I want to know what it's about. And so I want to have that opportunity to read it on my own and to come to my own decisions and move on. And but be able to engage in conversations with people in a way that's, respectful, and you value your opinions, which is all part of collaboration and all of this as well, that ties into social emotional learning too, because we're talking about relationship skills, but also the social awareness and empathy. And that's another topic that I've been talking about all week as well. So all of this ties in, and it's especially to me teaching a language class with my students, helping them to understand not everybody lives in the same type of a house as you, and helping them to build these connections with other students. So it's interesting to hear and to see and think about all of the different topics that are and things that are happening in the world, and realizing that we really do need to find ways to kind of bring that into our classrooms, to have those conversations so that our students and ourselves and our colleagues can adjust and, you know, go with, I don't want to say go with the flow, because it's really not a good flow right now with things that are happening in the world, but we have to be able to adapt and manage that stress and all of our emotions that go with that. So it's interesting how it all kind of comes back to that same focus, and it's so important. And there's so many things coming out about it, and looking at to see if anybody else has any questions. But beyond that, so let's say for teachers, or I mean anybody thinking about, let's pretend school's starting in 2 weeks, and we find out, okay, we are all online, not in person. What are some ways, I mean, who knows at this point, but what are some ways that we can help? And I've been asked this question a lot too, and I can think of different tools and things that are out there, but what are some ways that teachers can help students to build social emotional learning skills when we're not in that same physical space? Or some resources that maybe you might recommend that teachers could check out to look for some ideas, especially with remote learning and instruction?
Yeah, well, I always recommend Castle. Of course, castle.org. They have the best resources. And I do believe that they just released an SEL in returning to school document that you can take a look at too. I think that one of the best places to start with SEL is to know what SEL actually is. And I've had people say to me that SEL is synonymous with engagement. It definitely is not. They are two different things. And, you know, so saying that engaging students is addressing SEL is, you really have to look at the pillars that Castle has developed. I think that again, the SEL thing that they came up with, there's certain little things that you can help students with that are like specific to online. So for example, helping them learn to monitor their online usage. Whether that is helping them find the tools actually within their phones, if they're old enough for that, that tell them how long they've been on, how much time they spent on social media, how much time, you know, help them learn to monitor those types of things. That would be one thing that you could do. Helping students of all ages understand what mindfulness is, helping them to even go through some types of meditation, whether you find something online and you learn it yourself and then walk your students through it, ask them to do it for a couple days and report back on how they're feeling. There have been so many studies out there that there are ridiculous amounts of studies that point to meditation helping everything from depression, anxiety. There's a study that was done that said that regular meditation helps build gray matter in your brain, which helps with decision making and self-regulation and things like, you know, things that fall under the SEL kind of pillars that they have, or competencies. And so I would say that one of the ways is definitely for there to be some sort of focus on a meditation of some sort. There's the mindful coloring. I mean, there's tons of different mindfulness techniques that you can teach them. You can teach them how to run through breathing techniques when they're feeling especially anxious, how to recognize when they're starting to melt down. It's better to recognize you're starting to melt down and start to recognize those feelings than it is to get to the meltdown and have to go backwards. So, you know, helping them with things like that, dependent upon how old they are. I can't remember if I said this, I get asked so much, but like logistical things like time management. We often complain about our kids not being able to manage their time. We never ever show them how to do it. And so, give them a few strategies for minding their time, help them figure out which one actually works for them. It's not going to be the same thing that works for everybody. So give them a few strategies to try. Keeping organized. We complain about some kids not being able to keep organized, and it's generally only our high flyer students who keep their binders all neat and tidy that we're like, oh my gosh, those students are organized. But it may just be because we've only taught one way to organize. And so we haven't taught other ways to organize that might make more sense to our students who are a little bit more creative and less linear. And so you really can still address, like SEL feels like, because it's social emotional learning, like SEL feels like it's very abstract and emotional and things like that, but weaving it into some of those more practical things that we do online is one of the ways that you're going to get the kids to see that they can do this all the time. It doesn't have to be a separate course. It doesn't have to be a separate part of a course. It doesn't have to be a separate discussion. It is something that can happen all the time.
Right. Thank you. And I tried dropping in. It did not take the L the first two times. I'm not sure why, but it is definitely CASEL because it's the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. So, but they do have a lot of resources there, and they have a lot of resources for parents as well, which is nice for anybody to go there and just to get an idea of what it is, how you can kind of use some activities in your classroom. And so if there are no other questions from anybody, I want to say thank you to Mandy for joining us today and sharing all of this. And I will drop links to your site and your podcast and your blog and all of that in here. And next week, we will be back same time, 4 p.m. with my guest, Tisha Richmond, who will be joining us. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation next week. I will let you know later in the week what our topic is that we'll be discussing, definitely related to education. And so we'll hang out here for a few minutes and see if anybody has any last minute questions or wants to share anything. And I'll drop some of those links here and also in the session description.